When I was little, well, in my late 20s, I wanted to go to Japan. I wanted to be the greatest samurai in the empire. But instead, I had to watch about 131 movies. We tried to travel to Japan to explore the culture, but our plans were assassinated by a global pandemic. So Pat and I just stayed inside our castles and never came out. But still, we were happy. We would text about watching Japanese films and would forget about the lockdown. And then we had an idea. That is when everything changed forever.
That is when we left our boring quarantine lives and became the 70mm Samurai. We became podcasters who walk the road of vengeance. Vengeance on the pandemic. Instead of going to Japan, we decided to bring Japanese culture into our homes and watch as many Japanese films as we could. I don't remember most of this myself. I only remember the shoguns, the ninjas, and the blood. And I think I remember Godzilla too. Anyways, grab your popcorn and let the land of the rising sun into your homes via the nearest streaming app, Blu-ray disc, VHS tape, or open cinema. Welcome to the 70mm Samurai. All right, and welcome back to the second ever episode of the 70mm Samurai. I'm your host here, Pat, here with my co-host, Mike. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Been sitting inside our homes, watching a few different films, and really excited to be able to actually unpack some of these films for the first time on 70mm Samurai.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a great discussion here today on two films that we've selected for today's theme, which is 21st century Japanese film. And this was really prompted by the Japan Society, which is a US-based organization that is dedicated to promoting cultural exchange and understanding between the US and Japan. They have a number of film series, but just in February here did a film series on 21st century Japanese cinema, which I think a lot of the films that we're going to look at are older films, which is not a bad thing. Do not listen to anyone that tells you that old films are bad on Twitter or elsewhere, right, Mike?
Yeah, those people deserve to be thrown out of the internet, put in timeout.
Yeah. Timeout is a great place for people who don't want to watch old films. But these films are newer. These films are from the past 20 years. And it was a really great film series. It was 30 films, and it really looked back on the last 20 years as we obviously start the next 10 here for Japanese cinema. And it spotlighted a lot of the work from working directors, well-known working directors today from Japan. Kiyoshi Kurosawa, Hanzo Kore-ida, and then Takashi Miike, who directed one of the films that we're going to talk about today. We're all featured directors in this program. So I didn't watch all 30 films, Mike. I don't know if you managed to watch more than just the two that we are going to discuss here.
I did not, and a 70mm Samurai sticker goes out in the mail to anyone that could accomplish the feat of watching all 30 films in the series. Well done, and you are Japanese film buffs more than I could ever imagine.
Yeah, we should probably have you on the show here.
Yeah, you should be hosting.
Whoever that is,
please host this show for us.
But yeah, a lot of great. Honestly, there are some films that I'll probably go back and revisit from that listing when I get the chance to. So, the two films that we're talking about today, though, are The Twilight Samurai from 2002 and The Great Yokai War from 2005. So we'll get more into those in the next section. But Mike, do you want to just give us like a brief overview of the two and some of the key terms here?
Yeah. So they are two very different films. So that's one thing I'll immediately point out. And we're really going to talk about that in a little bit here. But The Twilight Samurai is a film that follows along
the Chanbara genre of Japanese film, which is basically just to say it's a samurai film. And I'm a big lover of samurai films, and this falls in that genre. It definitely takes a different take on that genre, which we will talk about. And then there's the Great Yokai War, which is a film that I think neither of us felt strongly about. It's a bit of a mess, but we'll chat about that. And it really takes a look at Japanese history and mythology with a modern spin on that. And obviously, Miike was a director there. But one thing I did take from that film, which I'm very glad for watching it for this reason, is something that I think when talking about our episode today is something that is really going to act as an overarching thesis. So the River Princess Yokai character from the Great Yokai War said something that was very striking in the film. She said, "Those who discard their past have no future," which I think we'll learn as we chat a bit more. Japan has great reverence for their history. They're not afraid to look back at it. Many of its great films, whether talking about the 50s and 60s, and a lot of the films we'll eventually talk about on this here that will be known as classics for ages and ages and ages, take place in the Edo period, which we will discuss and introduce further along as well. And that still exists within the Twilight Samurai as it takes place during that period. You know, whether it's movies the 50s, 60s, 2000s, Japan continually likes to look back at that period in their history. And then when thinking of old folk tales and mythology, which include these yokai characters highlighted in the Great Yokai War, are just a way of showing that love for their history and culture that go back ages and ages and ages.
Yeah, a long time, 1,000+ years of history that is being reflected upon there. So I think that was probably the most redeeming, interesting observation that we pulled from that film. But yeah, we'll be back next with a discussion of the Twilight Samurai. All right, so the first film that we're going to talk about here is The Twilight Samurai from 2002. And this was directed by Yoji Yamada, who was an older Japanese, still active, still alive Japanese director, sort of at the tail end of his career here, and it's led to something of a renaissance for him in the next 10 years by directing this movie, which was widely lauded within Japan and was actually Japan's nominee for the 2003 Academy Awards for foreign language picture. So a film that got a lot of good press and interest at its time. It was written by Yoji Yamada and Yoshitaka Asama from a series of novels by Shuhei Fujisawa. And it stars Hiroyuki Sanada as Seibi Iguchi, the titular Twilight Samurai, and Rie Miyazawa as Tomoe Inuma, who is his love interest. So, and Hiroyuki Sanada, our audiences may recognize him. He played the main samurai character, the equivalent character of Hector in Westworld season 2 when they go to Shogun World, and he was also a villainous character, briefly dispatched by, of all people, Hawkeye. Not a great way to go out, as being dispatched by Hawkeye.
It wasn't by Hawkeye; it was by Ronin.
Oh, okay, by Ronin, whatever. You Jeremy Renner. But he was the bad guy that he dispatches during his Ronin period in Avengers Endgame. So a high profile actor. But anyway, the movie itself is about feudal Japan. As the feudal Japan era draws to a close, a widower samurai experiences difficulty balancing clan loyalties, 2 young daughters, an aged mother, and the sudden reappearance of his childhood sweetheart. So, Mike, tell us about this film. I think this is one that you were excited to see before we had even talked about doing this project together.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Chanbara or samurai films. I love the genre. I'm a sucker for it. Really, all pockets of it, whether it's serious, campy, violent, dramatic, just sign me up. And this is one that has a lot of acclaim and one that was on my list for a while. So I'm so glad we decided to watch it as part of our episode here. So what I noticed off the bat when first getting into it is a bit of a throwback to samurai films from the 50s and 60s. And that's kind of the golden era, right, of these films. Kurosawa released a few amazing films in this era, in this genre. So you have vintage opening credits. You're introduced to Seibei, who is a samurai who's a bit of a loner and without many friends other than his family. And he's down on his luck. He's having a tough time, which a lot of, whether you look at Sword of Doom or Yojimbo, have this similar structure of the loner samurai or sometimes even a ronin. And it's also taking place in that Edo period, feudal Japan, and you see a lot of rural Japan. And Twilight Samurai has this in common with a lot of past Chanbara samurai films. But as you begin to watch this film, from the start, you might get that. And then you realize that it really is a bit of an anti-samurai film.
Yeah.
Much like if you've seen Harikari before, which please watch that. And I'm sure at some part in this series, in this 70 millimeter samurai experience, we'll visit it. But that is another anti-samurai film that it parallels a bit. Maybe not in structure, but in the message there. Samurai in some of these films, whether it's Yojimbo, Sanjuro, if you're looking at the Lone Wolf and Cub series, are seen as these cool, badass, violent guys that are extremely skilled with their sword and these cool loners. But when you look at the Twilight Samurai, it really digs into why the samurai system as a whole, especially during the Edo period, was flawed. And Pat, could you give us a little synopsis of what the Edo period was?
Yeah, so the Edo period, as a little bit of background here for our viewers, the Edo period, or the Tokugawa period, was the roughly between 1603 and 1868, which is actually the year that this film is set. And it represents a period in which Japan was ruled centrally by a military government called the shogunate. And the guy in charge was called the shogun. They still had an emperor. The emperor still lived in Kyoto, but the centralized government was administered from Edo, which became Tokyo. And effectively, the period immediately before this was the Warring States period, in which Japan was not united. The islands were divided into a series of warring kingdoms. There was basically constant civil war and strife. It was very bad for everybody involved. Not a stable time, not a fun time for anybody. And the result was this strong, centralized military government with the shogun at its head. And he, projected power and administered the islands of Japan through regional daimyo, which were effectively regional military governors that had, sort of absolute control over their territory as well. And it was a feudal system. These daimyo had samurai who were, swore fealty to the daimyo, who in turn swore fealty to the shogun. And so, similar-ish to feudal Europe, but with a very specific, time period, because the Tokugawa shogunate also shut Japan off largely culturally and economically from the rest of the world at this time, until, of course, the American gunboats arrived in 1853 to open up trade. So I guess, that is what it is. So, really interesting time period. A lot of the samurai films that we're going to watch are set either during this time period or during the Warring States period that immediately precedes this. But this film is really about the end of Edo and the end of the shogunate. So, what it was resonant to you about that? Like, what do we see happening to these characters as a result of that system collapsing?
Yeah, and I think it's no accident that it's taking place during the end of this period, and it almost acts as a bookend to the genre as a whole, in the way that it portrays the system behind samurai and just behind the Edo period. I think it really works in that way. But it shows the flaws in that system, right? And
Yeah.
one of those huge flaws, which I think is one of the strongest things this film does, is takes a look at gender roles during this period, and family life strained by the samurai system. This film is very different than other films in the genre, simply because we have a female narrator that is it. We're not seeing this thing mostly from the perspective of our male samurai. It's seen through at the time of we're seeing the film, a child's eyes, which is Seibei's own daughter. She is our lead narrator here, and she's telling it, reminiscing on old memories. She's telling it as an adult, but you're seeing the story unfold through her eyes as a child, which and clearly the gender roles in this system are very oppressed. It's easy to tell in this film that the most you can expect out of a woman is to be a housewife, and that's their main duty, and to be set up to be married with someone. And I think Seibei goes out of his way to ensure that his daughters have more than that, really praises them to be as educated as possible, to read as much as possible, and not just read the things that at the time. And I think another character comes in and speaks to their daughters in the film and mentions that they should be reading. There's women specific books that are telling you how to be a housewife, and that's the only thing they should read. And Seibei completely disagrees with that, and has them doing some uncharacteristic things for women at the time that this film takes place in, which is definitely different than a lot of the masculine samurai films that we've seen in the past, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of. I mean, by no means have I seen every Chambara film, or even a majority of them. But yeah, I can't think of really any equivalent characters to the daughters, or even Tomoe, who is the love interest here, who is the sister of is a childhood friend of Seibei's, sister of one of his friends, who participates in one of these arranged marriages to another samurai who turns out to be a violent drunk. Fortunately, she's able to get a divorce and get away from him, and into a position where she could consider remarrying Seibei, who is a widower. But you see Seibei for his daughters push against the expectations that society has for them, and then you see Tomoe push against the expectations that she has, and really pursue, in her own way, in her own sort of within the limitations available to her, pursue a relationship with Seibei, which is interesting. I think that's the system. Is You see the system collapsing in on itself, starting to come apart at the seams here, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who survive, right? The daughter is telling the story, and we find out after the action of the movie is done, which hopefully you've seen the movie at this point, this is not a spoiler, that Seibei dies in the Boshin War, which is the war between the shogunate and the emperor. And he doesn't live. He dies with the Edo period. And it is these female characters who are resilient and live on, which I just think is a really interesting statement, and a clever way of exploring that particular transition.
Absolutely. And speaking of transition, transitioning into when we're looking at Seibei, and I've mentioned this a few times already, it's just he's not your typical type of samurai that you're looking at least compared to other films in the genres. He is no Mifune type of samurai.
No.
He has no desire to fight, to use his sword, and in fact sold his only long sword he had, which another thing kind of going back to this theme is swords are so important clearly in this culture at this time. So selling your sword means you're really on dire straits, and that's revealed that he did sell his long sword at the climax fight in this film. But Seibei is not your typical samurai, and he's more conflicted and a little bit softer than the heartless, cold, skeptical characters we're used to seeing in these films.
Yeah, I mean, he says at one point that he literally wants to become a farm, like he wants to become a farmer, and that's really all the ambition that he has left in his life, which he unfortunately doesn't really get to live. He certainly doesn't get to live out his days doing that, but he wants different things from what the protagonists of a Yojimbo or Sanjuro or um, Sword of Doom and these other films that many of which we'll talk about. It's different. They're looking for different things. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, for definitely. And the other way I would say this film is different than what we're used to in the past is it low key is very influenced by I want to say Ozu. I think
Yeah,
a lot of Ozu films take some similar ideas and beats here, and just generally the mid-century domestic dramas that we saw coming out of Japanese films. There are a lot of interior shots. There's a lot of existential discussions about life while experiencing the mundane parts of life. There is only one fight scene in this film, only one sword battle. Some of these samurai films are just filled with blood and sword fights, and this film has one of those, and even then it's great, but it is pretty quick. And really the rest of the film is just the mundane parts of Seibei's everyday life
yeah,
and his struggles. It's driven by family and relationships, which if you've seen a lot of Ozu films, they're driven in the same way. It is emotional, it's quiet, and it's slow paced. And it's got a whole different type of film kind of secretly wrapped up inside what you would think is a average Chanbara film.
yeah, and I think that's really one of the most interesting things about this film, um, because you get that tension. There's this tension in those same domestic dramas. There's a tension between tradition and modernity, which is to some extent Seibei himself. To some extent, Seibei himself is pushing against tradition for his daughters, is pushing against tradition for himself. Partially because he's basically an impoverished samurai who can't afford new clothes and is generally dirty, which is frowned upon. Uh, but also he's pushing because of that. But he's also pushing because I think he just sees the flaws in the system and doesn't want to fit into that box himself or for his family. So, switching gears, we will be back next to talk about the Great Yokai War, and then to talk about how these two films relate. All right, so the second movie that we watched from this film series is from 2005, and it's The Great Yokai War. It's directed by Takashi Miike, who is a prolific and sort of well-known Japanese director here in the West. He also wrote, he co-wrote with several others the film as well. The only really notable star here is Chiaki Kuriyama, who many audiences will recognize as Gogo Yubari from Kill Bill Volume 1. And she was also in Battle, she's one of the teenagers in Battle Royale. So two movies that are, her performance is great in both those movies. She's one of the better performances in this movie. And what is it about? It's about a young boy is chosen as the defender of good and must team up with Japan's ancient spirits and creatures of lore to attempt to destroy the forces of evil. So, Mike, what did you think of this one?
Honestly, I am a fan of Takashi Miike and was looking forward to what seemed like a kind of wacky film here, but I sat down for a film that was much different than the Twilight Samurai, which when thinking about these films, I watched the Twilight Samurai before I watched this. So definitely got that to contrast with when trying to think about these two together. And a film that you can definitely tell was made in the early 2000s, unlike the Twilight Samurai, which could have been made really at any point in the last 50 years. One thing I'll say before we really get into it is when we're talking about yokai, there's a mythology behind that, right? The ancient spirits and creatures that Pat was alluding to are known as yokai in Japanese mythology and folk tales. And going back to the quote that we talked about that's in this film that we'll get to again at the end here, It has respect for Japanese history, to tradition, and folk tales, because the yokai are really the focus and the stars of this film. You see parades that revolve around yokai. You see the legend of the Kirin Rider, which is a story that our young protagonist kind of embodies. And yeah, it pays homage in the right ways and works with our narrative in that way. But there is a bunch of CGI in here, which is pretty cringy. Really, it looks bad. Like a bootleg Spy Kids at some points, I think. There's all kinds of colors and wackiness. And, they're really pushing that. This is modern Japan. But yeah, it really looks like a snapshot of the early 2000s. And I don't mean that, unfortunately, in a positive way. Pat, before I really get in the rabbit hole of some of the things I thought about this film and some of its shortcomings, do you kind of want to give your immediate gut reaction here?
Yeah, I also didn't particularly enjoy this film, and I wanted it to be over pretty quickly, more quickly than the 2-hour, 5-minute runtime allowed for. If we're 90 minutes, I think I'd be a little bit more forgiving of this film. But and I had high hopes too. I think it's a really interesting concept, and there's clearly a lot of artistry and love that went into the practical effect work for the yokai characters. But it just didn't, the elements do not come together. It wasn't very visually interesting to look at. A lot of time it was just like garish, and not in a good way, because garish can be done well. It was just garish, without any redeeming sort of visual qualities for me. So yeah, it was interesting. I didn't enjoy it, and probably won't revisit it.
Yeah, I don't think I will either. And garish could work if you get the tone right. And I think this film tonally all over the place. There was parts of it felt like a kid's fantasy film, almost like The Never-Ending Story or something in that realm, or even a Miyazaki-esque fantasy adventure, just a live action version. But sometimes it was like we were watching a grotesque body horror movie. It was like David Cronenberg up in here. And maybe Miike was trying to be Benicio del Toro, but if so, he came pretty short. As in part of this film, I'd like to look at even the sound. Sometimes it seemed like a goofy satire, fantasy-esque comedy. The score bounces between what would be found in a horror film and something of a whimsical, family-friendly adventure. There are some really weird sound effects, like a lot of boings and stuff like that that go on in this movie. And, sometimes it even seemed like it was a kaiju film. There were some Godzilla homages here, which, again, is great, paying homage to Japanese film history, but sometimes it's sci-fi, sometimes it's really heavy-handed on the social commentary. It's really trying to pull a nature versus technology basis around this plot, and all of these things thrown at the wall together really made for a mess of the movie. I think Pat, you mentioned it, but some of the practical effects, some of the makeup and puppetry of the yokai were great, and visually, I think those were something they could hang their hat on, and something they clearly worked very hard at. But everything from the screenplay to the plot to the CGI was just really a mess here.
Yeah, and I think we know that this can be done, right? Because, as you mentioned, Del Toro did this twice in the same time period. He did it with Pan's Labyrinth, and he did it with The Devil's Backbone, which are sort of fantasy stories with a child protagonist that are about, that feature these fantastical creatures and very practical effects. And those work great. I think this one needed a little bit more time in the oven in terms of story. I mean, even the thematic pieces are pretty clear, and they come through really nicely in terms of modernity versus tradition and the use of technology versus the natural world. I mean, you watch half of the output of Studio Ghibli, certainly the films that Hayao Miyazaki has directed, and you're going to see that same thematic through line, which is great. I don't know. It doesn't come. You can see too many of the seams and it's not wild enough. It's wild, but not wild enough for me. So, yeah, just not. I don't know. I don't have a lot more to say beyond that.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, Chiaki Kuriyama, who is great in Kill Bill, great in Battle Royale. She is interesting. You can tell she's really trying her hardest in this film.
Yes.
She's like this sexy BDSM villain with like this whip that's like an ultimate weapon. And that a huge problem was that she's more interesting and featured more than Kato, who is the big bad in this film. And really the embodiment of human waste and evil. And, he's barely in it and really a mess when he's in it. But her character is pretty cool, pretty BA.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's slim pickings as far as looking at some of the great stuff here. One thing I'm going to do, I'm going to give you my top 5 yokai in this film, as it does feature a lot of them. And there are some worthy shout outs and some really kind of mediocre characters here. We have Azuki Arai, who is the Bean Man, who, if you see the climax of the film, really works as comedic effect here. And he just counts beans, and that's his main power, strength, and responsibility as a yokai. There is Nirikabe, who exists as a wall and just to be a talking, walking wall creature, which I think was super cool. There is the pantsless river princess, who seemed very cold the whole movie. So I was hoping for, her to be all right during this film. But she had this wonderful quote that we talked about at the beginning of our podcast, and we'll hit at the end of our episode here. We have Suni Kasori, who is the excuse to sell toys in this film. It is the gizmo and main cutesy, like rabbit, squirrely-esque character that is kidnapped at some point during the film. And there's Karakasa, who was an umbrella with eyes, who looked pretty cool as an umbrella with eyes possibly could. And I want to shout out 2 that I thought were terrible. We have Karataro, who is like a middle-aged mutant ninja turtle. He was a constant presence through the film and thoroughly annoying, I think, the entire time.
See, I liked him because he's basically he's like a kappa, right? He's like a water creature.
Yes.
I thought that guy was like most earnest of all the yokai. He was like the most earnest and leaned pretty heavily into the camp in an effective way. This is a low bar, so I don't know. I kind of liked him, but
hey, each person's yokai is their own.
Yeah.
So hey, to each his own yokai. And then the last one I wanted to mention was Shoujo, who looked like an off-brand. I'm not sure if anyone's seen X-Men here, read the comics, seen the animated show, watched the movies. The character Beast. Shoujo looks like a kind of off-brand red version of Beast from X-Men. So that's what I thought of, and the best I could give for a description of his character in this film.
Yeah, that's actually pretty accurate. He looks like Beast. He looks like one of the He-Man characters, who may also Beast. I think Beastman is that guy's name. He looks a lot like Beastman.
Yeah.
So,
unfortunately, neither Pat or I enjoyed this movie very much, and it was kind of a mess. But it did show reverence to Japanese history, folklore, and culture. And now we're going to kind of wrap this all up and chat about these films and our takeaways overall from the 21st century Japan movie series.
All right. Well, we hope that you enjoyed our discussion of the Twilight Samurai and the Great Yokai War, at least more than we enjoyed the Great Yokai War as a film. But now we're just going to bring it back together and talk about what are our key takeaways here from our first episode, from the first 2 films that we're diving in on detail here. And Mike, I think, your point, that this quote that you've pulled, which I'll let you read again here, is really from the Great Yokai War of all places is really great. And I do think that it speaks to what both these films are about, and what is maybe also attractive to us about Japanese cinema.
Yeah, and I did not expect the core of this episode to really come from the Great Yokai War, being we really didn't enjoy it that much and take a lot from it. But this quote really works well, and I'm going to read it again. It was from the River Princess character in the Great Yokai War. It was those who discard their past have no future. So thinking about that in the context of Japanese film and culture as a whole, it is clear through both the Twilight Samurai and the Great Yokai War that Japan, even in the 21st century, even post 2000, has great respect, interest, and honor for their past, whether it's looking at the Edo era like we did in the Twilight Samurai, and whether it's shining a light to the system not being so great during that era, or whether it's looking back on some of the great mythology and folklore that are ages old in Japanese culture, and trying to see what those look like in today's society. I think both of those films really nail that, and it really makes it obvious that Japan is interested in its history and past rather than trying to overshadow it.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting to see these through lines because the mythology of the yokai has existed basically uninterrupted, for 1,000 years or more, and to see that as part of the discussion. And you see both. Okay, what is the continuation of that? But then you also see the need. I think there is a recognition of the need for change here, at least in the Twilight Samurai, as to that is in part of history and a historical look at what changed. But then also like that change is necessary, and it's that tension between the traditional and the modern that is really, I think is something we will see again, from some of the other film, especially, we talked about Ozu a little bit. We talked about these mid-century dramas. I think that same question is being asked and explored. And so I think it's something that we're going to come back to again and again on this program. So
yeah,
really interesting stuff.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think when looking at both of these films, you can obviously see that they also have honor for films in their genre, and great reverence for that. There's even a shout out to Gamera in the Great Yokai War, which I thought was great. Obviously, the climax of that film really is very ripped from Godzilla. So they're paying homage there. The Twilight Samurai would not exist without some of the Chanbara films before it, even if it's very different than your average samurai film. It wouldn't exist without taking a look at that history of rich culture in Japanese film, which I think we can both appreciate. Even if we didn't like the Great Yokai War, we loved the Twilight Samurai, we can recognize that both directors also have great reverence for Japanese film and take it very seriously, and Japanese culture as a whole.
All right. Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this discussion of our first theme, 21st century Japanese cinema, and the Great Yokai War and the Twilight Samurai. It's been interesting comparing and contrasting these two films. But yeah, if you liked this video, there's going to be a lot more coming. Please like and subscribe to the channel. And check us out below. We will link to our social media so you can keep up with us as to when to expect the next episode. And Mike, do you want to give folks? I think you have something there physically, and I have something here physically. Did you want to tell folks what to expect in our next episode?
Yeah, it's this bad boy right here, and not when we talk about this bad boy. This is the Showa era box set from the Criterion Collection on Godzilla. We will not be covering every film in our next episode, but we wanted to introduce our overarching theme that we're going to continue to come back to several Godzilla films in this collection, But our next episode will be focused on the original Japanese Godzilla film, a film a lot of people love, and then the American recut of that film that came shortly after. We're gonna take a look at both of those. So please watch those at your leisure. They're available on the Criterion Channel and HBO Max as well.
We hope that you enjoyed this first content episode of the 70mm Samurai. This is the 70mm Samurai signing off.
Sayonara.